want to remind you of the story of Joseph. As a boy, he was a favored son of his father's. He had a number of older brothers and even a sister, and yet Joseph was the favorite. Joseph got a special coat that his father made just for him. It was a colorful, bright, very obvious object of his father's favoritism for Joseph. And Joseph, as it would seem, was also picked out by God. As Joseph received some visions from the Lord of some special dreams that seemed to indicate that even his own family members would one day bow down to him. And he relayed those things to his brothers to predictable results. And so his brothers were frustrated with him, upset with him, and before long grew to hate him. And so as Joseph was sent one day to go and meet with their brothers and provide for some of their needs and see if they need anything, the brothers used it as an opportunity. Let's get rid of Joseph. So they threw him in a pit and were contemplating on how to kill him. The oldest brother, Reuben, says, no, let's see if we can figure something else out, trying to preserve his life. And a passing band of Midianites just happened to be traveling by. And the brothers said, we've got some opportunity now for some financial gain. Let's sell our own flesh and blood brother into slavery. And that's what they do. And it's estimated Joseph was about 17 years old. They sell their brother into slavery. And Joseph, of course, goes into slavery and becomes really the top man over a man's household, a man named Potiphar. And there's nothing really that Potiphar doesn't put under his care. And Joseph becomes very, very important, very influential in that household. And yet what happens is Potiphar's wife sets her eyes on Joseph and desires to sleep with him. And Joseph, in great integrity and righteousness, says something that is very important for us in how we view sin ourselves. And he says, Potiphar's put me at the top. Potiphar's given me everything. There's nothing that is outside of my realm of control and influence. And I've touched every area of Potiphar's household except you. And then he says this, how could I do such a thing and sin against, he doesn't say Potiphar. He says sin against God. How could I do this thing and sin against my God? And well, Potiphar's wife doesn't take too well to that. Joseph is able to run out of the room, but he leaves his cloak behind, and she uses that as evidence of impropriety on Joseph's part and has Joseph thrown in prison. And he remains there for years. And while he's in prison, he steadily gains more responsibility and influence within the jail, and so much so that the jailers give Joseph responsibility over all the prisoners. And two important prisoners show up one day, the king's cupbearer and the king's baker. And they each have a dream. And they tell their dreams to Joseph because these dreams trouble them. And Joseph says, tell me your dreams. And the cupbearer has this dream about, really what it results in is Joseph saying, you're going to be released someday. You're going to be released actually in 3 days. And you're going to be returned back into the service of the Pharaoh, of the king. The baker thinks, it sounds like these are good interpretations of dreams, and he offers his dream, and Joseph says, well, in 3 days you're going to be beheaded, you're going to be killed, you're going to be food for the birds. And so what Joseph tells the cupbearer is he says, remember me. Remember me when you get released. He says, I have done nothing deserving imprisonment. I've done nothing deserving of where I am right now. And so he says, he professes his innocence and appeals to the cupbearer to speak on his behalf to the king. And the cupbearer is released just as was foretold, and he forgets all about Joseph for 2 years. And then the Pharaoh has a dream, and the cupbearer goes, now I remember. When I was in prison, there was a man who had told me what my dreams meant. Maybe he can do the same for you. And of course, through the series of events, Joseph interprets the dream of the king. He's released from prison and set really essentially as prime minister over all of Egypt, all the land. Okay? And that's the story of Joseph, a man who kept his integrity, spent 13 years of his life either as a slave or in prison, and yet was a godly man. Didn't deserve what happened to him, and yet he trusted completely in the will and work of God. And that's important, I think, as we come to this text. Acts chapter 25, I must admit, this one gave me some trouble this week. The word God is not even in the chapter. And so trying to figure out how to preach some of this was interesting for me. But as we look at the last verse of chapter 24, verse 27 there, it says, when 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. And desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. Here Paul, in his integrity, in his holiness, and in his righteousness, finds himself in prison for no just cause, no real reason, no legal or religious purpose whatsoever. He's just left in there at the whims of a politician. And yet for 2 years he's there, unrighteously. And now he is set before a new governor, this new governor Festus. And that's where we find him in chapter 25. And that is important for us to recognize, that here Paul has done nothing wrong, finds himself in prison, keeps his integrity, strives to do what's right, and just wants to be known as a godly man who loves Jesus and wants to be bold in telling others about his Savior. That's who Paul is. Many parallels to the story of Joseph. But it's a good reminder for us that, you know what? It usually doesn't work out the way we think it's going to work out. Life is full of hardships, trials, difficulties, sufferings, things we don't see coming. But what we see here described in chapter 25 is the Jews grasping at straws, anything they can come up with, anything they can invent to try to do harm to Paul. We see the governor being described as a man who at first might seem like he's a good change from the old governor, but no, we find out really he's just as corrupt and immoral as the previous governor. But what do we see in Paul? A man of character, a man of a clean conscience before God, and a man who's able to even provide a strong defense before others. I have done nothing against God or man. I am innocent. And we see in Paul a man of quiet integrity and a righteous defense. And that's where we need to strive as well as God's people. Clear conscience before God and being able to provide a strong defense before men. So let's look at this serious confrontation that takes place between Paul and the governor. Verses 1 through 3. It says, now 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea, and the chief priests and the principal men of the Jews laid out their case against Paul. They urged him, asking as a favor against Paul that he summon him to Jerusalem, because they were planning an ambush to kill him on the way. The situation between the Jews and the Romans was kind of a delicate one. About 200 years before this, the Jews had risen up in a very, very successful revolt called the Maccabean Revolt. And they revolted against the Greeks at the time, but won so many battles, were so successful in their revolt, that they achieved a good deal of independence from the Greek Empire, so much so that the Romans were willing to accept much of that same independence that the Jews had earned for themselves by revolting. But what does that mean the Jews are now known for? Revolting, causing trouble, doing the things that they want to do. And if the governors and the Romans and the empires, they don't like it, well, you know what we can do? Cause you a lot of trouble. And so that's why you even see with Pontius Pilate this desire to appease the Jews, to make sure that there were no riots and mobs and no trouble in the streets. We've seen that all through the book of Acts. This desire, this intense desire to keep the peace. Okay? And a part of that is this delicate relationship between the Jews and the Romans. And the Jews were very good at using this tension to their advantage. Master manipulators of the governors. That's what the Jews were like. And so the Jews had, as this new governor had been installed, Felix, who handled a particular revolt quite brutally, was recalled by the Emperor Nero and installed this man, Porcius Festus, in his place. And so within 3 days, Festus, he goes from Caesarea to Jerusalem, to the main city there under his command, and he meets with the Jews, meets with the chief priests, and you know what they do? They bring up Paul. It's been 2 years. They haven't forgotten. Yeah, that Paul guy. We hate him. And it is their desire to get Festus to get rid of him one way or the other. And the first thing they try is subterfuge. This plot that they had planned a few chapters earlier of trying to kill Paul in transit. If we can get Paul kind of in this weaker situation, get him on the move, maybe less under guard, less protected, we can kill him on the way, and that's their plan. They're going to ambush him. And so they say to Festus, hey, why don't you bring Paul over to Jerusalem? We'd like to talk to him. Ha ha ha, right? That's not their plan, but that's what they're telling Festus. And so what we see from Festus is something actually seemingly good, verses 4 and 5. Festus replied that Paul was being kept at Caesarea, that he himself intended to go back there shortly. So, said he, let the men of authority among you go down with me. If there's anything wrong about the man, let them bring charges against him over there in Caesarea. So he seems unwilling, for whatever reason, to give in to what the Jews want, at least so far. And so Festus seems to be able to hold his own against the manipulation of the Jews. But that's, of course, not where it stays. Verses 6, 7, and 8. After he stayed among them not more than 8 or 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. And the next day he took a seat in the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. When he had arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him that they could not prove. And Paul argued in his defense, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense. And so we see here many parallels with the trial of Jesus, of course, and I brought that up for a number of weeks now. But the litigation here and charges are fueled by pure hatred rather than evidence. The Jews hate him, they want to get rid of him, and they'll do whatever they can to make that happen, even at a lack of evidence. And so, as Paul has done before, he denies all of these charges. There's no religious or legal reason for him to be kept in prison or for him to be punished in any way. But of course, what is most important for us to recognize is his incredible Christian character. Right? He's a man of integrity. He's an example to us of, as God's people, of what it means to know how to live as a Christian. And when there's pressure, when there's tension, when there's accusations, it's quick for us to lash out ourselves, respond in ungodly ways, for us to even act foolishly and try to circumvent things or sneak and hide and do whatever we can to escape those discomforts. But here Paul is displaying what being a Christian is. Being a Christian is having godly influence over every area of your life. It's not just spiritual and moral that God affects. It's your work, your relationships, your finances, your hobbies, your use of free time, and it's also whether you stand up in front of a governor, judge, or king, or whomever it is. Being a Christian affects everything we are. And Paul here is saying, you know what I've been? I have been a good citizen of the empire. I haven't done anything wrong. Paid my taxes, done my job. I've obeyed the laws. I've done what's right. There's no religious or legal reason for me to be here at all, other than the Jews hate me and they want my blood. So the Jews here are shown to be grasping at straws, but Paul here appears humble, confident, and even content. He's just trusting in God. He's resting in God's grace. He believes that God's going to take care of him and that God still has a future and a plan and a purpose for his life. But as politics often does, it comes into play here with the man Felix. We see that in 9 through 12. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, "Do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me?" But Paul said, "I'm standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you yourself know very well. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. But if there's nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar." And Festus, when he had conferred with his council, answered, "To Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go." So politics comes into play, and Paul's life is put in potential danger because a politician wants to improve and solidify his position. Not because he's done anything wrong, but because Festus wants to make friends with the Jews, do them a favor, improve his relationships, improve his standing. And whether he's aware of the plot or not, probably not. He just wants to do the Jews a favor. The text is clear on that. But he asks if Paul will be willing to travel to Jerusalem. Paul here is not having it. He knows what's in store. He was aware of the plot the first time, even if Festus was not. And so I think there is something, though, that is important for us as God's people to be aware of. I think there's actually two things. First, we have to be careful. Be careful not to grow cynical or paranoid about the world that we live in. We live in a world that still hates Christ. We live in a world that is still antagonistic towards Christians. But something we cannot afford to do is grow cynical, bitter, pessimistic, and paranoid. We have to be careful as Christians that we don't think that everybody's out to get us, that there's always a conspiracy, that's always against us. We have to be cautious of that. We have to be careful of that. And we can never forget that God truly is in control. You remember that. And so, we must be careful, but we must also be ready. Be ready for when rulers and governments will one day care less about justice and more for their own agendas. Will one day desire to put Christians in jail simply for the fact that they love Christ. We must be ready that they will one day, that rulers and governors and officials will one day make decisions that hurt Christians if it is to their political benefit. That one day they will oppose the church if they see it somehow getting in the way of what they define as progress. We need to be ready for that. Jesus says, be ready. The world will hate you. If they hated me, they will hate you. Peter says, don't be surprised when the world hates you. We recognize this reality. The world hates Christians because we are Christians. So we must be ready. We need to be careful not to be cynical and paranoid, but we must be ready that this is a reality. These things are true. They do happen. Okay? Think of other legal cases that have happened in the last 10 years. Poor bakers and photographers and people who worry about their livelihood because somebody is willing to go to them and make legal cases and attack them and do harm to them. These things certainly happen today, and we need to be ready for that as well. Not ready in the sense that we got to fight back or attack or that sort of thing. We need to be ready in the fact that we need to know it's going to happen. It could happen to us. We shouldn't be surprised that it's going to happen. And we need the poise, grace, patience, and confidence that Paul has here. Okay? We don't freak out because the world hates us. We rest in the promises of God. That's what we're ready for. Okay? But what Paul does here is he exercises the Roman law provocatio, the right of a Roman citizen to appeal to the emperor. And here, it's a reminder for us that Paul was always going to get to Rome, okay? We knew that all the way back in chapter 23, where the Lord shows up to Paul and tells him in the night that it's God's plan for Paul to testify about him in Rome. And so Paul here is just taking steps to do that very thing. And it's again a reminder for us that Paul is much less concerned with his own defense legally and much more concerned with his ability to witness and testify about Jesus. This is why when I go to any kind of gathering of people, I'm thinking, if they put me up front, I know what I'm going to say. I'm going to tell them about Jesus, whether they like it or not, right? And I've been to Christian concerts and these big gatherings where people get together and Christians are up front, and I'm just like, say it, do it. Do it. Look at all these people, right? And tell them about Jesus. What? And when they don't, I'm just crushed every time. A few years ago, we had a family reunion at our house, and all these family members from all over. I hadn't seen many of them in years and years. And they asked me to pray. It was at our house, and so I got to pray before the meal. And I'm sure some of them hadn't prayed in a long, long time. But I just took it as an opportunity. I'm going to share the gospel right now. Hope that's okay with you. Whether it is or not, I don't really care. I'm going to tell you about Jesus, right? And so they let me speak, so I told them about Jesus, right? And that should be what is in our mind and heart all the time. Opportunities to tell people about Jesus. I'll tell you what, I've never, ever regretted telling someone about Jesus. But I've regretted many opportunities I let go. That's the regret I have, is when I haven't taken advantage of those opportunities. There might have been where I said something to somebody about Jesus where I was like, I shouldn't have said it like that, or I shouldn't have said it this way. But I've never regretted speaking up about the person of Jesus Christ and what he's done. Never, not once. But I've regretted many times not taking those opportunities when they've been provided to me. And here, it's a reminder that is what Paul is doing. I mean, I even just wrote down in my notes, like, what if you were invited to the White House? What would you do? And this is what Paul is asking to do. Take me to the emperor. Take me to the head guy. Put me in a room with him. That's what I'm asking for. That's what Paul's doing. He's not doing it because he's like, I got to get out of this any way I can. I'm a Roman citizen, so I'm going to utilize this as a way to get out of this. He always knew he was going to Rome. Always knew it. He just wants to tell people about Jesus, even the emperor himself. He's going to take whatever opportunity he can. And so when we ask ourselves, I mean, remember, Paul's been in jail for 2 years. That's the time we remember. When we ask ourselves the question, God, why does it have to be so hard? Why does it have to be like this? I did not know it was going to be this difficult. I didn't expect it to be like this. Paul was in jail for 2 years. Joseph was in jail for 13, along with his enslavement. A slave or in jail for 13. God's got a plan. It's not going to look how like you think it should look. We need to get that in our minds. We rest in the glorious grace and the sovereign will of God that he's got a plan. But of course that doesn't mean we don't do anything either, right? Paul is the one who's making this appeal. He's the one saying, send me to the emperor, send me to Nero, bring me before him. I appeal to the emperor, okay? Paul knows he's going there, but he's also willing to work towards what he knows. I think that's right for us to do too, as long as we work with integrity and righteousness within the means that are provided to us in God's word, that if we're working for God's will and God's ways, we're doing exactly what we've been called to do as God's people, okay? And that's what Paul's doing here. I appeal to the emperor. And once he made that appeal, Festus was actually bound to send him. He didn't have really a choice in the matter. And so, but now he is kind of stuck. Okay, and I'll explain that here in a minute. But we go here from this confrontation that Paul has with Festus, and now we come to a curious conversation. And with that, we see the introduction of 2 new people in verse 13. When some days had passed, Agrippa the king and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and greeted Festus. So Agrippa, this is Herod Agrippa II. His father, Herod Agrippa I, was a brutal, awful man. He's the one who imprisoned Peter and then executed James, the first martyr there. The first martyr of the apostles anyway. In Acts chapter 12, we see Herod Agrippa doing that, but God strikes him down later on in that same chapter. Herod Agrippa II is his grandfather. So his father's Herod Agrippa I, obviously. His grandfather was Herod the Great. Okay, so this is a very distinguished family, important family, and a family who are very, very friendly to Rome. Even the place where they're staying at right now, Caesarea, okay? Herod the Great built this city. He wanted his own port. He wanted a place that ships could actually stop and unload cargo. Israel had nothing like that. Judea had nothing like that, so he built one. He built this city, and he built a long dock, if you will, that ships could unload at. And he was trying to think, what do I name this important city that I, Herod the Great, have built? Caesarea. Best friends with Caesar, right? That's what he's saying with that name. We're going to name this great, important city that I just built Caesarea, because Caesar's my best bud, right? Herod the Great, best friends with Caesar. All the Herods were close friends with Caesar, with Rome. Okay, which kind of, and for some, especially the Zealots, the Herods were not very popular amongst some of the Jews because of that friendship. Now Bernice is also mentioned in verse 13. Now Bernice, this is where things get sketchy. Okay, Bernice is Herod Agrippa II's consort and full-blooded sister. Okay, yes, you heard me. Yeah, so she was previously married to somebody else, and then he died, and she's like, I'm just going to go home and start sleeping with her brother. Well, she's actually, or because this incestuous relationship has such a bad reputation in the land, the emperor requires her to marry somebody else. Well, that guy dies off. I'm wondering if there's some suspicion there. I don't know. She ends up coming back to Herod Agrippa, her brother. And so that is who Bernice is. And both Agrippa II and Bernice were brother and sister to Drusilla, which we saw back in chapter 24. Okay, interesting family. So, but Herod Agrippa, okay, the second, this Herod Agrippa, the emperor gave him control over the land of the northeast of Judea. So Herod Agrippa is not even ruling in Judea. And yet what the king has given him is also control over the temple. Herod Agrippa got to pick who the high priest was. Herod Agrippa was in charge of the treasury of the temple. He's not even the king in Judea. He's not the king in Jerusalem, but he is the one who's in charge of all these things in the temple. This is because the Romans recognized in Herod Agrippa someone who was an expert at Jewish law, Jewish custom, and would have a better handle on these things than they would have had in governing over the Jews. And so Herod Agrippa was considered an expert in Jewish law and customs, and really an invaluable ally to the Roman rule in the region. So when Herod Agrippa and Bernice show up, Festus sees this as a great opportunity to figure out what's going on about Paul. What do I do with this guy, right? And this is one of the things I love about this is really that there's a lot of parallels and things you already know in the verses that are coming up ahead. It's really him just relaying what's happened so far. This is all stuff you know. But that's what Festus is doing. He sits down to lunch with Agrippa. I don't know if they had lunch there or not. I'm sure they had lunch, but they sit down together, and Festus is like, I got to tell you, I got this guy back in the prison, Paul, and he's throwing me for a loop. I don't know what to do with this guy. He's like, what do I do? And he sees in Agrippa as maybe someone who can help him out, because he's like, I've got to send him to Nero, and they're going to want a report. Right now, this is what my report looks like. Dear Nero, here's Paul, a prisoner. I'm sending him to you. My name's Festus. That's all I got. I don't know what else to put in this report, right? If you people who have reports you got to fill out for work, right? You know, you want to know what to fill in there. Festus has no idea what to fill in. He has no idea what to put in this report, so he's going to Agrippa for help, okay? And what I want to ask you, just before we even get into the text, is, are we living the kind of lives that make other people have conversations like that? right? Are other people talking about us for good reasons, right? Because we love Jesus and we talk about Jesus and we're living for Jesus, and that just baffles them. Are people having conversations, your coworkers, friends, and family? And the thing I thought about was, you guys all remember when Terry, he's not here today, so I can embarrass him and he doesn't know about it. When Terry brought that brisket and the pulled pork, man, oh man, people were talking about that for weeks. I mean it, weeks. Like, oh, that was so good. That guy can cook for us every week, right? They were talking about it because it was so good, right? Now, if I brought the food, you'd be talking about it for weeks too, but for a very different reason. Be like, I hope Aaron never brings up food again, right? Are people talking about us because of our relationship to Jesus Christ? That's what's happening with Paul. We've got the two most important people for miles and miles and miles around, the two most important people in the region, and they're sitting down talking about Paul, right? Because of his relationship with Jesus Christ, with his message of Jesus. And so let's get into some of these verses. Verses 14 and following. As they stayed there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There's a man left prisoner by Felix. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews laid out their case against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. I answered them that it was not the custom of the Romans to give up anyone before the accused met the accusers face to face and had opportunity to make his defense concerning the charge laid against him. So when they came together here, I made no delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought. When the accusers stood up, they brought no charge in his case of such evils as I supposed. Rather, they had certain points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus, who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Being at a loss how to investigate these questions, I asked whether he wanted to go to Jerusalem and be tried there regarding them. But when Paul had appealed to be kept in custody for the decision of the emperor, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I'd like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, said he, you will hear him. And so we see, right, Festus has nothing to report to the emperor about Paul, and he's probably stressing a great deal about that. But part of that is because of his great ignorance and confusion about anything to do with Christianity. He's like, Paul keeps talking about this Jesus guy. And apparently he was dead, but Paul's saying he's not dead, right? This is what we call essential Christian doctrine. The resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead is essential. We must believe it or we are not saved. And here Festus had never even heard about it. This is weird religious argument, and now I'm thrown in the middle of it. The Jews are saying one thing, Paul's saying another, and I'm at a loss as to how to investigate this. And yet, we also know that Agrippa is also stuck because he put himself in a position where he was trying to choose between what was right and what he wanted. This could have all been over a long time ago. Paul stood up before Festus. Paul says, I'm innocent. Festus looks into it, says, yes, you are. See you later. You're no longer in jail. You are free. It could have been over that easy. But that's not what happens. He's like, oh, maybe I can. That's what you do when you're evil, right? Maybe I can, make friends with the Jews this way. I can use Paul to my own advantage. That's what I'm going to try and do here. And now he finds himself, when Paul says, I appeal to Caesar, now Festus is like, oh no. I tried to get something out of this. I tried to earn something. I tried to connive and sneak into a better relationship with the Jews. I should have just let him go. It could have all been over. Yeah, the Jews might have been unhappy with me, but that really was the right thing to do. But I didn't do that. I tried to sneak and get something selfishly, and now I'm stuck. Boy, does that speak to how many of our decisions go in life, doesn't it? We just would have done the right thing first, right? If we just would have made the right choice not told the lie, not tried to be sneaky, not tried to be selfish and greedy and get what we wanted, we wouldn't find ourselves stuck in certain unpleasant situations. And so that's where Festus finds himself, stuck about Paul. And Agrippa offers to hear the man himself, and perhaps Agrippa can shed some light on the situation and help Festus with his report. And so Festus readily agrees. And so verse 23, on the next day, Agrippa and Bernice come with great pomp. They entered the audience hall with the military tribunes and the prominent men of the city, and then at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. There's so many ironies in this verse, okay? The freest man in the room is the one brought in chains, right? The greatest and most important man in the room is the one who's there in rags and in prison clothes, right? And so we see this great room filled with all these important people, and then, like the last second, they drag in Paul, right? And so Paul is now able to stand here before Festus again, and he finds Agrippa and Bernice there, and so Festus begins and opens the gathering with kind of a brief statement, which would have been appropriate. Verses 24 and following. Festus said, King Agrippa and all who are present with us, you see this man about whom the whole Jewish people petitioned me, both in Jerusalem and here, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. But I found that he had done nothing deserving death. And as he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to go ahead and send him. But I have nothing definite to write to my lord about him. Therefore, I've brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after we've examined him, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable in sending a prisoner not to indicate the charges against him. Boy, the way he says this, right? It's like a kid trying to tell you they didn't do something wrong when they actually did do something wrong, or they're trying to tilt the story in their direction. It's just also true to human nature, right? We all tell stories, and all of a sudden we're telling more fiction than truth. But Paul here, he finds himself denied justice and freedom due to the fickle whims of politicians and their power plays and their pursuit of selfish goals. But rather than falling into despair or self-pity, Paul sees this as a part of God's plan and as an opportunity not only to trust him, but to tell other people about him. And what we're going to see in chapter 26 is Paul's second defense and sharing of his own testimony. And it's actually the third time the salvation conversion of Paul is shared in the book of Acts. And it's done very powerfully, and it's going to be very good for us to see. But what I want you to take away from this right now is we should see Paul's character and demeanor certainly as encouragement. He's doing what's right. And that should be enough for us. We still live in a world that's confused about Christ. We still live in a world that's antagonistic towards Christians. And what I want to encourage you with is we can certainly persevere. Okay? God has given us the grace. God has made us promises. And those things will surely take place. No one can snatch us out of his hands. Amen. Glory is assured. No kind of trials or difficulties in this life will feel momentous or mountainous forever, right? They will feel like light, momentary afflictions when compared with the eternal weight of glory that is promised to us, God's people. Take comfort in that. Yes, life is hard. There's people who will hate you just because you claim the name of Christ. But you can persevere. You can persevere with integrity and trust and grace because you are God's child. He's given you all that you need. Take Paul as your example, but live in light of the gospel of Jesus Christ that you've committed to and that has saved your soul. Let's go from here and do that very thing. Let's pray.